Welcome to the Haunting Hour. Tonight, you'll hear a collection of real horror stories that are perfect for a dark, rainy night. These tales are unsettling, mysterious, and all claim to be true. Whether you're here to sleep or stay up with the lights on, settle in, relax, and listen closely. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Let me know which one kept you up the longest. The house was a low split level from the early 60s, wedged between a weedy drainage lot and a boarded-up duplex. I moved into it with my daughter during a stretch of early spring rain that made everything feel soggy and swollen. The front steps bowed slightly under our weight, and the doorknob had to be turned twice before the latch gave in. It smelled like old wood and wallpaper paste, and for reasons I didn't understand, I felt the need to whisper when we unpacked. The kitchen floor had this strange patch of discoloration under the table. I thought it was water damage, but when I tried to scrub it, nothing came up, not even a mark. The pattern of the linoleum shifted subtly at that spot, as if something beneath had bubbled just enough to lift the print. The first week passed without incident, unless you counted the light in the hallway that flickered whenever I passed by. I chalked that up to wiring. The outlet sparked when you tried to plug in anything heavier than a phone charger, and there were whole sections of the wall that felt soft, like they hadn't dried out properly since the last storm. It was around the second week when Lily started waking up with nosebleeds. Not just streaks either. Her pillow would be soaked, and sometimes she wouldn't even notice until I came in to check on her. She'd be sitting upright, calm, but confused, holding a tissue against her upper lip like she was waiting for something. When I asked if anything woke her, she said, "The breathing," then went right back to sleep. I didn't know how to respond to that. I took her to the doctor, who said it was likely dry air. But it wasn't dry in the house. The whole place felt damp. It clung to the walls and made the stairs creak in places that didn't make sense. One night after putting Lily to bed, I stayed up to grade papers. Around 10 o'clock, I heard what sounded like someone walking across the kitchen. The steps were deliberate, not like the wood settling or the clatter of a mouse. I thought maybe Lily had gotten up, but when I checked her room, she was sound asleep. I stood outside her door for a moment, listening, then made my way back down. The kitchen light was off, but there was a pale blue glow coming from the floor beneath the table. At first, I thought it was moonlight catching some reflective surface, but when I got closer, I saw it was coming from that same discolored patch, not shining on it, emanating from it. I bent down, placed my palm against it, and pulled back instantly. It was ice cold, not just cool to the touch, genuinely freezing, like touching the inside wall of a freezer. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, trying to rationalize it. I told myself it was a ventilation problem, maybe a draft, maybe poor insulation in the floorboards. But the more I looked, the less that made sense. The cold was concentrated to a space no larger than a dinner plate. The rest of the floor was room temperature. I didn't tell Lily. I didn't want to scare her. 2 nights later, I woke up to her standing beside my bed. Her eyes were wide, not in fear, but in this fixed sort of way, like she'd walked there without really knowing why. I sat up and asked what was wrong. She whispered that the girl under the table had touched her leg. I tried to stay calm. I walked her back to her room, tucked her in, and left a light on. But when I got back to the kitchen, I stared at that spot for what felt like hours. I thought about peeling up the linoleum, but something about that felt final, like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. A few days passed quietly. I convinced myself that it had been sleepwalking, maybe a dream. I even made plans to replace the flooring. But before I could follow through, something else happened. I was in the living room, folding laundry, when I heard a sharp snap from the kitchen. I thought it was a dish breaking, or maybe the light fixture falling. I rushed in, but nothing looked out of place. except for the fact that all 4 chairs were pulled away from the table and facing outward. Not just slid aside. They were arranged symmetrically, each one rotated exactly 90 degrees from the table. I didn't hear them move. I was just in the next room. That night, I put a heavy box of books over the discolored patch. It was the kind of absurd thing you do when you're trying to pretend something can be physically contained. I laughed at myself for it. I even joked with a friend on the phone about my haunted linoleum. But around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke to a loud thump. The box had moved. Not far, maybe 2 feet to the right. But it had left a trail behind it, dragging against the floor. There were no marks or scuffs, just the suggestion of motion, like the floor had been subtly worn down along the path it had taken. That same morning, Lily refused to go into the kitchen. She stood at the edge of the hallway and just stared at the table. When I asked why, she said, because she's waiting under it again. I didn't ask who she was. By the end of the month, the light that flickered in the hallway stopped turning on altogether. The air around the kitchen grew colder, even on warmer days, and that glow, that strange bluish shimmer, became visible even in daylight. I pulled back the linoleum and found what looked like a square outline in the wood beneath, like someone had cut a hatch but sealed it back up. There was no handle, but I could feel the groove with my fingernails. It took me most of the evening to get it open. I used a crowbar and a flathead screwdriver, peeling back the planks like stubborn bark. Eventually it gave way, and I found a small cavity no deeper than 2 feet. Inside was a square of stone, smoother than the wood around it, and covered in soot. In the center, a faint ring was carved, with strange curved markings along the outer edge. It wasn't concrete, it wasn't brick. I couldn't place the texture. That night, Lily screamed. I ran to her room and found her pointing toward the door. She said the girl had tried to crawl in, but couldn't because of the light. There was no one in the hallway. I sat up with her until morning. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the walls made me flinch. The following day, I invited my sister to visit. She didn't believe in anything supernatural, but I thought maybe a second pair of eyes would help. She lasted less than 10 minutes in the kitchen before she said she felt lightheaded and had to leave. She told me I needed to have the place blessed or get out altogether. I didn't tell her about the hatch or the stone. Instead, I covered it back up, resealed the linoleum, and started looking for other places to live. But the house wasn't done with us. 1 week before our scheduled move-out date, Lily came into the living room with something in her hands. She held it out to me. It was a piece of cloth, faded and damp, with a faint lace edge. I asked where she found it, and she said it was on her head. I didn't understand. I asked who she meant. Lily said, the girl under the floor. When I checked the kitchen, I found one of the chairs knocked over. The others were gone. I looked under the table. There was nothing there. But the glow had deepened. It wasn't blue anymore. It had turned into this dull amber haze, like the last light of sunset seen through smoke. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the hallway, watching the kitchen door. Around 2:15, I heard something shuffle across the floor. It was subtle at first, like bare feet sliding slowly. Then came a sound like nails tapping wood. I held my breath, thinking it might stop. It didn't. I looked into the kitchen, and the glow was stronger. The floor itself looked warped, like the wood had softened into pulp. The air was thick with that same cold I had felt weeks earlier. And then I saw it. An arm. It wasn't reaching out. It wasn't moving. It was just resting against the edge of the open hatch, thin and pale, with fingernails darkened by dirt. I ran to Lily's room, grabbed her, and we slept in the car that night. We moved out the next morning. I didn't pack. I didn't tell the landlord. I left the keys in the mailbox and didn't leave a forwarding address. But the dream followed me. I see her sometimes, in the seconds between sleep and waking. Her face is always turned away, her dress soaked at the hem, her hands resting flat against the floor like she's listening for vibrations. I don't let Lily out of my sight now. I don't own a table. For a while, I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress. That between single parenting, moving, and the strain of teaching through backlogged grading, my mind had finally cracked in some quiet, manageable way. But then Lily brought something else home from school. A drawing. I found it in her backpack, folded in quarters, smeared in purple and gray. She told me it was the lady, and I asked what that meant. She said it was who lived under the house. She said she could hear her scratching at night, asking to come out. I tried not to overreact. I told her it was just a story. But the way she looked at me made my skin go cold. There was no fear in her expression. It was closer to sympathy, like she understood that I didn't want to believe. A few nights later, I had the dream again. I was standing in the old kitchen, only this time there was no table, just an open hatch and a staircase spiraling downward into a narrow hole. I could hear a woman humming from below. Not a melody I recognized, something cracked and tuneless, like a lullaby played backward. I didn't want to go down, but I felt pulled. I made it to the first step before waking up, gasping, with a nosebleed of my own. The pillowcase was streaked with red, the exact same way Lily's had been. I got up and checked on her. She was asleep, peaceful. No blood, no movement. I walked through the apartment, turning on every light, checking every window. And in the silence between footsteps, I heard it again, tapping. Not from within the apartment, from underneath it. I have never told anyone this part. Not my sister, not Lily. I haven't written it down until now. But sometimes when I'm alone, I still feel that spot under my feet, that invisible weight, that stretch of unseen space pressing upward. It's not the kitchen anymore. It's not even that house. It's something else. Something that stayed with us, that wants to be remembered. I never went back. I don't drive past that neighborhood. I don't search property listings near that drainage lot. I don't want to know who lives there now. I only hope they never peel up the linoleum. I was 26 when the dreams began. At first, they were more strange than frightening, like my mind was dragging me into someone else's memories. Each time, I woke up confused, heart pounding, but I could still shake it off after a few minutes. It wasn't until the third dream that I started feeling genuine fear. The kind that settles in your chest and doesn't go away when the sun comes up. In the dream, I was walking through a long, narrow corridor. The kind you find in abandoned hospitals or old government buildings. The air was stale, warm with dust, and thick with something else I couldn't name. The lights overhead flickered like they were dying, leaving the hallway in uneven patches of light and shadow. I remember feeling that I shouldn't be there. Not just because it was empty, but because I felt watched, not followed, not hunted, just seen, like something was studying me and waiting. It always started the same way. I turned a corner into that hallway, and something in my stomach dropped. Not because I saw anything, but because I heard it. A heavy, dragging sound, like something metallic being pulled across concrete. At first, it was faint, almost like it was coming from the level above me. But step by step, it drew closer. I could never tell from which direction it was coming. It echoed, ricocheted, and wrapped around me until my ears rang. By the fourth dream, I began waking up gasping. I tried explaining it to people, friends from work, my sister, even my neighbor who dealt with sleep paralysis. But I could tell they didn't understand. They thought it was stress or something I ate. I nodded and smiled to keep the conversation short, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. I didn't feel stressed. I wasn't grieving or working too hard. There was no logical reason for the dreams to start, let alone keep coming. About a month into it, the dream changed. I made it farther than I ever had before. This time, the hallway led me to a door. It was made of dark wood, the kind that looks swollen from years of moisture. My hand trembled when I reached for the handle, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened it slowly, and behind it was a room, small, windowless, and silent. I stepped inside, then I heard the dragging again. Closer, right outside. I backed into the far corner, crouching low, barely breathing. The door trembled with the weight of something slamming against it. Not a fist, not a foot. It sounded blunt and metallic, heavy enough to rattle the frame. I closed my eyes, bracing for the moment it would break. But it never did. Just as it splintered, I woke up. That was the first time I noticed something strange the next day. I had a thin red mark along my shoulder, like a splinter or scrape. It was nothing serious, but I couldn't explain it. My sheets were smooth. I hadn't bumped into anything the night before. Still, I brushed it off and went to work, pretending everything was fine. The dreams kept coming. Always the same structure. Always the same pressure in my chest. The dragging sound. The heavy door. The sense of being trapped. And then something new started happening. One afternoon, I was walking back to my apartment from the grocery store. It was sunny, warm enough for short sleeves, and the neighborhood was full of people. As I passed the coffee shop on the corner, I felt a cold rush run down my spine. I turned my head, scanning the street without knowing what I was looking for. Then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the block, just past the parked cars. A girl, maybe in her 20s. She was wearing a long dark coat, even though it was hot out. Her face was angled down, hair draped like a curtain. I couldn't make out her features. What struck me was the stillness. Everyone else was moving, crossing the street, riding bikes, talking on phones, but she was completely motionless. I blinked. A car passed in front of her. When it cleared, she was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone ducked into a shop. Maybe I just imagined it. But that night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up watching documentaries with the lights on, trying to forget the way she stood, the wrongness of her presence. 2 nights later, the dream came back worse. This time, the hallway was darker. The dragging started sooner, and the sound was faster, like whatever was making it had gained speed. I ran. My breath echoed louder than my footsteps. I reached the wooden door and slammed it shut behind me. I locked it. For the first time, I felt the cold metal of a deadbolt in my dream. I backed into the same corner. Then the knocking started. Not with a fist, but with something hard, flat, and brutal. The door cracked. I looked up. There was a face staring at me through the split in the wood. Her eyes were wide, not from fear but from joy. She smiled when she saw me. Her lips were cracked and dark. Her skin looked bruised and uneven, like it had been broken and poorly stitched. I screamed and woke up with blood on my pillow. My nose had started bleeding in my sleep. At this point, I stopped telling people about it. There's only so many times you can say, "I'm fine," before the words start to sound fake. I threw myself into work, stayed out of the apartment as long as I could, but the fear always followed me. It wasn't in the shadows. It wasn't in the creaking pipes or flickering lights. It was internal. Like the dream had carved out a place in my head that didn't belong to me anymore. One Saturday evening, I visited my aunt, who lived about 40 minutes away. She was one of the few people I trusted with things I couldn't explain. She practiced a kind of holistic medicine, mostly herbs and energy healing. I hadn't told her about the dreams until that night. She sat with me, held my hands, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stood up and walked into her bedroom. She returned with a small box and placed it in my lap. Inside was a black and white photo. It was old, maybe from the 1930s. A woman stood in front of a wooden house, her hands clasped in front of her dress. Her eyes were pale and empty. There was something in the way she stared at the camera. Not anger, not sorrow, just vacancy. Behind her, near the doorway, was a faint shape. A blur that resembled a child. My aunt said the photo came from her grandmother's collection. She didn't know who the woman was, only that the photo had always given her a sick feeling. I looked at the blurred shape again. It was hard to make out, but I felt something tighten in my chest. The posture, the slope of the shoulders, the faint outline of hair that didn't move with the wind. It all looked too familiar. I thanked her, made some excuse about needing to get home, and drove back without listening to music or turning on the air. The silence felt safer. That night, I didn't dream at all. I thought maybe the photo had acted like a purge, like I'd confronted something old and severed the connection. I felt clearer, more present the next morning. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel watched. It lasted 3 days. Then, while folding laundry in my bedroom, I noticed the window was open. I hadn't opened it. The screen was pushed out, resting against the fire escape. There was no sign of a break-in, no mess, no missing items, just the window, gaping open as if someone had leaned in and watched. I shut it and locked it. Checked every room, called a friend to come over and stay the night. She brought wine and tried to distract me with stories about work and bad dates, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see that same motionless girl, coat buttoned to the throat, hair hiding her eyes. The next dream was the worst. This time, the room wasn't empty. When I reached the wooden door and locked it, there was someone already inside, not moving, not watching, just standing in the far corner where I used to hide. As the banging started behind me, I turned toward the figure. It was me. Not a reflection, not a version. It was me. Same clothes, same injuries, same expression of mounting dread. She looked right through me, eyes unblinking. The door cracked open behind me, and I turned just in time to see the girl from the street. Her face was clearer now. She didn't look dead. She looked content. She raised something above her head. A pipe, maybe. A bar of iron. She swung. I woke up on the floor, soaked in sweat. My legs were numb, like I'd been lying there for hours. I dragged myself to the bathroom and vomited. That was the last time I slept without sedatives. The pills kept the dreams away for a while, but they didn't stop the other things. The waking moments started to twist. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of mirrors, just a flicker before the reflection caught up. My own face began to feel foreign. I'd look at my hands and wonder why they didn't look the way I remembered. There were moments when I'd stand in front of the mirror and stare too long, certain something in the reflection would move differently than I did. One evening, I came home to find every photo in my apartment flipped face down. I lived alone. My door was locked. My windows were shut. Yet every single picture, the ones on the shelf, on the wall, even one tucked in a drawer, had been turned. I picked one up and turned it over. It was a photo from my graduation, me in a cap and gown standing between my mother and sister. Except my face was wrong. The smile was too wide, the eyes too flat. It wasn't the photo I remembered. I tore them all up and threw them in the trash, but the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it grew. I began to sense that I was no longer alone in my body. It wasn't possession. It wasn't madness. It felt like something had moved in and was learning how to wear me. The final breaking point came a few weeks later. I had taken a weekend trip to a cabin a friend owned, hoping a change of place might help. The first night was quiet, too quiet. No wildlife sounds, no wind, no distant hum of cars. I lay awake in the silence until my ears buzzed. Around 3 o'clock, I heard a knock at the door. Not soft, not polite. 3 hard, deliberate strikes. I didn't move. Then I heard the dragging. It circled the cabin slowly, scraping across the wooden porch, rounding each corner until it came back to the door. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just waited. The knocking never came again, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something waiting just outside the front step. A black and white photo. It was the same woman from my aunt's collection. Only this time, there was no blur in the background. The child was no longer a shape. She stood in full clarity beside the woman, her hand in the woman's hand. It was me. Same face, same eyes. I burned the photo. But I knew it was too late. Something had passed through me, and it had stayed. When When I think back on that August, it's not the heat that comes to mind. It's not the humidity, the sweating through my shirts, or the constant hum of old air conditioning units working overtime. What I remember most is the sound. That horrible clicking drone that started low, almost like it was inside the walls. Then it got louder, and then it moved. I had never been good with insects. I could handle spiders, sure. Even centipedes didn't bother me too much. But anything with wings, anything that buzzed or whirred, it turned my stomach. I always chalked it up to a childhood incident with a hornet's nest in my grandfather's barn. It left me with 3 scars behind my left ear and a deep-rooted unease I couldn't shake. Still, that summer I was trying to prove to myself that I could live on my own. I had just turned 32 and had taken a lease on a place just outside Wilmington, a little complex called Oak Hills that looked better on the brochure than it did in person. The outside was brick and dull green trim, nothing special, but it was cheap and quiet, and that's what I wanted. The unit itself, apartment 11, was on the 2nd floor. It had a balcony that overlooked a patch of trees, and if you stood at just the right angle, you could pretend you were deeper in the woods than you really were. I liked to sit out there in the evenings with a cold drink, listening to the crickets, trying to let go of the city noise I'd left behind. For a while, it worked. The quiet was nice, until it wasn't. It started 2 weeks after I moved in. I remember the first time I heard it because I had just gotten back from a grocery run. I was standing in the kitchen, unpacking a bag of apples, when I noticed a strange chirping coming through the window. At first, I thought it was a bird. It had that same pitchy, rhythmic tone, but it didn't change or shift. It just went on, same volume, same tempo, without pause. It felt artificial. That was the word I used in my head, like it wasn't coming from nature, but from a machine trying to imitate it. I walked to the balcony and leaned over the railing. There was nothing out there. No birds, no visible nests, no odd machinery. Just trees swaying under the pale orange sky. I stood there for a few more seconds, and then the sound stopped. Not gradually, not like something flying away. Just silence. Immediate and complete. That should have been the end of it. A weird noise, probably nothing. But the next night, it came back. This time, I was lying in bed, reading. The air conditioner had just kicked on, and I heard that same mechanical chirping cutting through the white noise. Except now it was louder. Closer. It didn't sound like it was outside anymore. It sounded like it was inside the walls. I sat up, trying to pinpoint it. I pressed my ear to the drywall beside the window. Nothing. I moved to the headboard. Still nothing. But the noise kept going. When I stood in the center of the room, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. That awful, grating chirp. It wasn't until I opened the closet door that I realized something was really wrong. The second I pulled it open, the sound stopped again. Just like before. I stared into the closet, scanning the top shelf, the floor, behind the hanging clothes. There was nothing. No holes, no bugs, no nest. Still, I took everything out and checked. I even ran my hand along the baseboard and inside the closet light fixture. Nothing. But the next night, it returned. This went on for 4 days. The noise would start right after sunset, last for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, then vanish. Each time it felt like it was getting closer. One night, I thought I heard it coming from behind the kitchen cabinets. Another time, it felt like it was in the bathroom vent. Always moving, always stopping when I tried to investigate. By the end of that week, I had trouble sleeping. My eyes were always drawn to corners, to small cracks. I bought traps, sprays, anything I thought might stop whatever this was. I even called the complex manager, a tired man named Harold, who sent a pest guy out the next morning. He was polite, thorough, spent almost 2 hours inspecting every inch of the place. When he finished, he handed me a clipboard and told me there was nothing. No droppings, no wings, no signs of entry. I asked him if cicadas ever nested inside buildings. He gave me a look that said he thought I was wasting his time and said no, they don't. Not like that. Not in this region. Not unless there's a serious breach, which I didn't have. That night, the sound didn't come back. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Stress, new environment, my mind playing tricks. I actually slept through the night for the first time in a week. I felt better, calmer. I went about my day like normal, went for a walk that evening, and picked up some Chinese takeout. When I got home, it was already dark, but I didn't feel anxious like before. I set the food on the kitchen table, turned on the light, and froze. They were on the ceiling. At first I thought they were leaves. Big dry leaves stuck to the white paint. But then one twitched. My stomach dropped. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more, all spaced out in a perfect grid. Their legs were wrapped around the ceiling texture, their wings folded tight. Not a single one made a sound, not even a rustle. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, step by step. My breathing got shallow, and I could feel the blood rush to my face. I closed the door behind me and stood in the hallway, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I just saw. I turned on every light in the apartment and armed myself with a broom before returning to the kitchen. They were gone. Not dead, not fallen, gone. The ceiling was bare. I even got a chair and inspected the spot where I'd seen one twitch. No marks, no residue, nothing. That night, the sound didn't return, but I didn't sleep. The next 2 days were uneventful. No chirping, no ceiling bugs. I kept telling myself maybe they'd flown in through the balcony door when I wasn't paying attention and left on their own. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The way they'd been arranged, so still, so deliberate, it wasn't natural, and it didn't feel like an accident. The final night began like all the others. I made dinner, watched a bit of television, and checked the locks twice before going to bed. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to silence. But it wasn't normal silence. It was heavy, pressed in on my ears like I was underwater. I sat up, already knowing something was wrong. I didn't hear the chirping. I didn't hear the air conditioner. I didn't even hear the distant traffic I'd gotten used to. I got out of bed and stepped into the hall. The light switch didn't work. None of them did. The apartment was pitch black. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and used the flashlight. The moment I turned the corner into the living room, the light caught something on the wall. At first I thought it was a stain, a dark patch near the thermostat. But as I got closer, I saw it was moving, pulsing. I leaned in and saw that it was a hole. Not big, maybe the size of a quarter. And from it, insects were pouring out. Not in a swarm, not fast. Just one at a time, methodical, like they were being pushed through. They were black with iridescent wings, clicking softly as they crawled along the wall and disappeared behind the picture frames, the furniture, the vents. I stumbled backward and nearly dropped my phone. The beam swung across the ceiling and I saw more of them, hanging from the corners, tucked into the molding, crawling in rows along the ceiling fan blades. Dozens of them, maybe more. And still, not a single sound. Then I noticed the smell. It was like wet wood and copper, thick and metallic. It filled my throat and made my eyes water. I turned toward the balcony door, hoping to fling it open and get out. But when I pulled the curtain aside, I stopped cold. There was a man standing on the balcony. He wasn't moving. His head was tilted just enough to suggest he was watching me, but I couldn't see his eyes. He wore a coat that looked wet. The fabric clung to him like it had been soaked and dried over and over. But what made me scream wasn't his face or the way he stood. It was what was behind him. The sliding glass door was sealed from the inside, locked. And behind the man, hanging from the balcony ceiling, were more insects, hundreds of them, packed into rows, motionless. Then they began to click. I don't remember unlocking the balcony door. I don't remember crossing the room or grabbing my keys. I just remember the next few minutes as a blur of motion and panic. I ran, through the apartment, down the stairs, out into the parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached the far end of the complex. I crouched behind a hedge and stared up at my unit. The balcony light flickered once, then went dark. I called the police from behind that hedge. I could barely keep my voice steady enough to explain what had happened. 2 officers arrived about 15 minutes later, and I followed them back up to the apartment. They didn't see anything unusual. The lights were on. The walls were clean. No insects. No signs of forced entry. No man on the balcony. They asked if I had taken anything that evening. I hadn't. They asked if I'd been under stress lately. I had, but not enough to imagine all of that. One of the officers stayed with me while the other walked the perimeter of the building. When he came back, he was holding something in a gloved hand. It was a cicada. But not just any cicada. It had a thin piece of red thread tied around its middle. Tight. Almost like it had been tethered. The officer said it was probably a prank. Maybe a neighbor with a weird sense of humor. I didn't argue. I nodded, answered a few more questions, and told them I'd be staying with friends that night. I never went back to that apartment. The next morning I called a moving company and asked them to pack up everything they could. I never stepped foot inside again. I found a new place across town and paid the last 2 months of rent just to be done with it. I didn't want the deposit. I didn't want answers. I just wanted to feel normal again. But I haven't. The noise still follows me. Not every night, but enough to know it isn't gone. Sometimes it comes through the air vents. Sometimes it's behind the mirror. I never see them anymore, but I hear them. That same mechanical clicking, always starting low, always growing louder. And the worst part is, I've started to hear it in other people's places too. When I visit friends, when I stay at hotels, it's never in the same room. Always somewhere nearby, always just out of reach. Last week, I visited a cousin who lives 2 towns over. While I was in her bathroom, I noticed something strange under the sink. Tucked behind the pipes was a single red thread, curled, frayed at the end, and on the tile beside it was a wing. Just one. Dry, cracked. I didn't tell her. I just said I wasn't feeling well and left early. I've been staying alone again, listening, waiting for the sound, because I know now. They're not random. They're looking for something, or someone, and they found me. It was just past 6 o'clock when I pulled off the main road and onto the narrow gravel trail that led up to the cabin. The sun had dipped below the ridge earlier than I expected, and already the woods had swallowed up most of the light. I remember the way the trees pressed in on both sides, so dense and dark that I couldn't see more than a few yards past the first line of trunks. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me and the old place my dad built back when I was a kid. I hadn't been there in years, but after everything that happened this past spring, I needed the silence. I needed to feel small again. Alone. The air changed the moment I stepped out of the truck. I noticed it right away, the way the cold seemed sharper, more still than it had been down in town. Even the birds had gone quiet. No wind, no rustle. Just my boots crunching over dry leaves and the metallic click of the lock as I opened the front door. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry pine, old stone, and something else I couldn't place at first. Not quite mold, not rot. More like something left out too long. Something that had been forgotten. I didn't light a fire that first night. I unpacked, cracked open a beer, and settled into the couch with an old book I found wedged under the cushions. The power was still working, though the light in the hallway flickered like it had a bad bulb. I told myself I'd fix it in the morning, and ignored the uneasy knot forming in my gut. The kind of knot that doesn't go away just because you tell it to. Around 10 o'clock, I stepped outside for a smoke. The moon had climbed high, casting long shadows across the clearing. I stood by the porch railing and listened, waiting for some sign of life out in the woods. But there was nothing. No crickets, no frogs, not even the hum of wind in the branches. I remember holding my breath without realizing it, like I was expecting to hear something, or trying not to. That was when I first saw the light. It flickered between the trees, pale and low to the ground, maybe 30 yards off the edge of the clearing. At first I thought it was a flashlight, maybe a hunter or someone camping off trail, but it didn't move like a flashlight. It hovered in place, too steady to be swaying in a human hand, but too erratic to be a fixed source like a lamp or lantern. I watched it for a full minute. It blinked once, then disappeared. I stayed out there for a long time, eyes fixed on the spot where the light had been. Nothing returned. Eventually I forced myself inside, locked the door, and turned on every light in the cabin. I left the hallway one off. That flicker felt like a warning. I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up to small sounds, creaks in the floorboards, the dull pop of the wood paneling adjusting to the cold. At least, that's what I told myself. But sometime just after 2 o'clock, I heard something that wasn't structural. It came from the back of the house. A soft knock. Not forceful, just precise. 3 steady taps against the wall behind my bed. I sat up, heart pounding in my throat. I didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. Just stared at the far wall, trying to convince myself it was a branch or an animal. But the pattern was too clean. Not scraping, not random. It had rhythm, intent. The next morning I checked the outside wall behind the bedroom. Nothing out of place. No low-hanging branches, no tracks in the frost-covered grass. I walked the perimeter of the cabin twice. Still nothing. I didn't want to admit it, but the dread hadn't left me. It clung to the air like smoke. I spent the afternoon stacking wood and fixing the porch steps. I tried to stay busy, ground myself, but I kept glancing back at the tree line. There was a pressure out there, just beyond view. A tension I couldn't name, like something was watching from behind the thickets, waiting for me to turn my back. Around 4 o'clock, the light came back. This time it was closer, maybe 20 yards into the woods just beyond the deadfall where the pines grew thickest. I saw it through the kitchen window as I washed my hands. It was smaller than I remembered, more compact, still too steady for a flashlight. I stared at it for nearly a minute, then blinked. When I opened my eyes, it was gone. I didn't go outside that evening. I pulled the blinds, lit a fire, and kept my back to the windows. I tried reading again, but every few seconds my eyes drifted toward the dark spaces beyond the curtains. I could feel something changing in the air. The silence outside had taken on a weight. It wasn't peace, it was vacancy. The kind of silence that only happens after everything else has fled. Just after midnight, the knocking returned. 3 soft taps, then silence. This time it came from the front wall near the window. I stood in the hallway, frozen, listening with every muscle in my body locked. The fire was still crackling behind me, but that knock didn't match the rhythm of a house settling. It came again, 3 taps. Closer. Then I heard the click. It came from the back door. A slow, deliberate sound, not loud but unmistakable. The latch being tested, gently, as if whatever was outside didn't want to break in. It wanted to be let in. I stepped backward into the living room, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I didn't grab a weapon. I didn't even reach for my phone. I just stood there, waiting, staring at the hallway like something might emerge from it. But nothing did. At sunrise, I checked the doors, all locked, no sign of tampering, no prints on the back step. I tried to shake it off, but I was running out of excuses. Too many strange things, all with the same cadence, the same unexplainable quiet. That third night, I made a decision. I set up a small motion camera on the porch, something I used for trail monitoring back when I hunted here with my dad. I aimed it toward the tree line where I had seen the light, just to see if anything moved through that part of the clearing. I barely slept, but the camera caught something. When I checked the footage the next morning, I expected to see nothing. Maybe a deer, a raccoon. But what I found chilled me. Around 2:20 a.m., the light appeared again, low to the ground, hovering just inside the woods. Then it moved, not walked, not swayed. It glided forward, too smooth to be human. The camera's motion sensor triggered again 30 seconds later. and the next frame showed something standing just at the edge of the porch. Not in detail, just a vague shape, narrow and still. Not animal, not man. And then one more frame, a single second of footage. The porch light was on, but the figure had vanished. No footprints, no noise, just one more set of 3 taps, recorded cleanly in the audio, sharp and deliberate, followed by silence. That was when I packed my things. I didn't even finish folding my clothes. I threw everything into the truck and didn't bother with the rest. The air around the cabin felt wrong, heavier than before, like whatever had been lurking in the woods wasn't hiding anymore. I started the engine and backed out without looking behind me. As I pulled away, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The motion camera was gone. The tripod was still there, but the device itself had been ripped off. Not cleanly. The plastic housing had deep scratches across the top, long, uneven gashes like something with claws had pulled it apart. I didn't stop to investigate. I couldn't. The drive down the mountain was slower than I liked, but I couldn't risk sliding off the gravel path. Every turn of the wheel felt like a countdown. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that light again, floating down the middle of the trail behind me. But the woods stayed black, thick and unmoving. I made it home by noon, but I didn't go inside right away. I just sat in the driveway with the truck still running, trying to slow my breathing. The silence from that place had followed me. I could feel it sitting just outside the cab, waiting for me to move. I finally gathered enough nerve to cut the engine and walk inside. Everything looked normal. The thermostat blinked its usual numbers. The living room was just as I'd left it, but the dread didn't lift. That night, the knocking started again. 3 sharp taps right outside the bedroom window. I jumped out of bed and threw open the curtain. Nothing. No wind, no animals, no sign of movement. I checked the yard, then the doors, all locked. Nothing out of place. But the fear that had lived in those woods was here now in my home, settled into the corners like it belonged. Over the next week, I heard it every night. Always 3 taps, always just after midnight. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the glass, never frantic, just patient, precise. The light never returned, but the feeling did, that same silence, that same waiting. And then one morning I found my trail camera in the mailbox. No note, no postage, just the camera, scratched and dead, placed neatly like a gift, or a threat. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. It's been over 7 months now, and I still don't sleep through the night. I've moved to a new place, far from the woods, far from anything that might carry even the shape of a tree. I gave away everything that came from that cabin. The furniture, the tools, even my dad's old books. I couldn't stand to keep anything that might have soaked up that presence, that silence. But the knocking hasn't stopped. It changed, though. Now it comes from inside the house. It started about 3 weeks after I moved. I'd be in the kitchen or brushing my teeth, and I'd hear it. 3 knocks. Always 3. Not from the walls this time, but from inside a closet, or the attic, or the closed pantry door. I've checked every time, opened every door, every drawer, every crawl space. There's never anything there. But the air feels colder after, like something slipped out while I wasn't looking. I don't talk to anyone about it anymore. I tried once, early on, and I could see the way people looked at me, like grief had scrambled my sense of what was real. But it hasn't. I know what I heard, what I saw, what followed me home. I started sleeping with the lights on. At first it helped. For a while the knocking would pause. I could go 2 or 3 nights without it. But lately it doesn't seem to care. It comes no matter how bright the room is, no matter how loud the TV is. The silence cuts through everything. Last night, something new happened. I woke up at 3:15, heart racing, no clear reason. I hadn't heard anything yet, but I could feel it, thick in the air. I sat up listening, waiting for the knocks. Instead, the bedroom door creaked open on its own. It didn't swing, it didn't slam. Just a slow, deliberate shift. I sat there in the bed, frozen, staring at the dark gap that had opened into the hallway. Then the knocking came, 3 soft taps from inside the room. I didn't move. I couldn't. My skin went cold, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I scanned the bed. Then I looked at the corners of the room. Finally, I checked the window. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something had followed me out of that forest. Not a person, not an animal. Just a silence that waits, that watches, that remembers. I was 24 when I agreed to meet a stranger for dinner. I had just moved to a quiet part of Vermont to escape the noise and heat of the city, and I didn't know many people outside of the few coworkers I spoke to at the bank. One of the tellers, a woman named Monica, had told me she had a cousin visiting from out of town and insisted we'd get along. I wasn't really into blind dates, but after 3 weeks of spending every evening alone in a cold apartment with nothing but humming radiators and wind scraping the windows, I figured I could use the company. The restaurant wasn't fancy. It sat just off the main road between a used bookstore and a small gift shop that always had wind chimes swinging on the porch. Inside, it was dim and quiet, with just a few older couples scattered between booths. The place had an old fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and the floor creaked every time someone walked past. The air smelled like overcooked meat and sweet wine. I got there a little early and sat near the back, nursing a glass of water while checking the time every few minutes. He arrived right around 7 o'clock. His name was Evan, and he was pleasant enough. Clean shirt, decent manners, easy smile. But within 15 minutes, I knew it wasn't going anywhere. He talked mostly about himself, college football, his job in real estate, a fishing trip he wanted to take that summer. I nodded and smiled, asking polite questions, but my mind kept drifting. I felt the way I used to during church as a kid, restless, bored, waiting for it to end. Around the time our food arrived, I noticed the waiter watching us. He was tall and thin, maybe late 30s, with a shaved head and this strange calmness about him. His smile never reached his eyes. I tried not to stare, but every time I looked up, he was there, standing just a little too long by the drink station or glancing over from the kitchen door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then I caught him looking directly at me while Evan was talking about the engine in his truck. The waiter gave a small nod, like he understood something I hadn't said out loud. When Evan went to the bathroom, the waiter approached the table. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there with the notepad in his hand, glancing at my half-eaten chicken and then back at my face. "You doing okay?" he finally asked. I hesitated, unsure of his tone. There wasn't anything warm about it. It didn't feel like concern. It felt rehearsed. I said I was fine, just on a first date. He nodded again. "He's not your type." It wasn't a question. It was flat, quiet, like he already knew the answer. I smiled awkwardly and shrugged. The waiter leaned a little closer. "I'm off in 10 minutes. If you want to leave, I can give you a ride." There was something about the way he said it. Not sleazy, not even confident. Just matter of fact, like this was a normal thing he offered people. I didn't respond right away, and he didn't push. He just gave a slow blink and walked off toward the kitchen. When Evan came back, I was still staring at the spot where the waiter had stood. I didn't mention the conversation. Evan asked if I wanted dessert, and I told him I was full. We finished eating, paid, and left. I remember stepping outside and looking back through the restaurant window. The waiter was at the same table, clearing the plates, but his eyes were on me. He didn't blink that time, just watched as we walked to the car. Evan drove me home. We talked a little in the car, mostly about work. When he dropped me off, he asked if I wanted to go out again next week. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled, then waited until I was inside before pulling away. That night, I didn't sleep well. The heater had started clicking again, making this hollow metallic sound every few minutes, like a knuckle tapping against a pipe. Around 3 o'clock, I got up and walked through the apartment just to make sure everything was locked. I even checked the kitchen window twice. The air felt heavier than usual, like the rooms weren't entirely mine. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, watching the streetlight spill across the living room carpet. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the image of the waiter's face. The next morning, I got up around 6:45, made coffee, and flipped on the television. I didn't normally watch the news, but the headline caught my eye. Woman found dead behind local restaurant. The broadcast cut to a scene I recognized immediately. The same parking lot Evan had pulled into, the same red brick siding. There was yellow tape across the alley and a police cruiser near the dumpster. The reporter spoke with that same calm tone they always use for crime stories, but my stomach tightened with every word. The victim hadn't been identified yet. She was described as being in her mid-20s, dark hair, average height. Found late the night before, behind the restaurant, with signs of a struggle and several bruises on her neck and chest. No weapon had been found. The camera returned to the anchor, who announced that a suspect was already in custody. They were being held for questioning pending formal charges. Then the screen changed again, showing a mugshot. It was him, the waiter. His name was listed as Daniel K. Freeman, age 38. Arrested just after midnight at a residence about 30 minutes outside town. According to the report, he had been flagged by security cameras and identified by the restaurant staff. One of the other waiters said he had stayed late that night, long after closing. No one knew why. I didn't realize I had spilled my coffee until I looked down and saw it spreading across the table, dripping onto the floor. I sat there for a long time, heart racing, trying to remember every word he said to me, every glance, every moment I might have missed. I kept thinking about that offer, 10 minutes, a ride home, that calm, emotionless voice, the way he stared at me as I left. I told myself I had imagined the whole thing, that it wasn't as serious as it felt. But when I got to work, Monica met me near the break room. Her face was pale, her mouth trembling. "You went to Redwood Grill, right?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't say anything else for a while. Then she handed me her phone. It was already open to a news article with the same picture I had seen earlier. She had to sit down. I did too. The rest of the day felt distant. People talked, phones rang, keyboards clicked, but none of it reached me. My ears were filled with a different sound, the memory of that soft, deliberate voice, the words he said, the look in his eyes. 10 minutes. I couldn't stop thinking about that timing. If Evan had taken longer in the bathroom, if I had said yes, if I had walked out the back door with a stranger who spoke like he already knew the end of the story. I didn't tell anyone else about it for a long time. It felt too surreal, too close. I moved to a different apartment 2 months later, farther from town. I started locking my bedroom door at night, even though I lived alone. I couldn't walk past that restaurant again. Even the smell of wine made my chest tighten. And still, sometimes, when I'm alone and everything's quiet, I think about his face. The calm expression. The stillness in his voice. Not anger, not charm. Just that same quiet understanding, like he was waiting for something. Like he already knew I was supposed to say yes. It wasn't until a year later that I heard about him again. I had mostly avoided local news, but a coworker at the credit union mentioned the trial in passing. She didn't know I had been at the restaurant that night. I kept my expression blank, but my heart started pounding before she even finished her sentence. The trial wasn't long. Daniel Freeman pled guilty to avoid a death sentence. The details came out slowly. How he had targeted women sitting alone or on bad dates, how he waited until closing, how he learned their routines. The prosecution said he had done it before in another state, but this was the first time he'd been caught. The woman he killed that night wasn't even on a date. She had just stopped in for a drink after work. Alone. Unlucky. Easy to follow when the lot emptied out. I read about her later. Her name was Rebecca. 27. worked at a veterinary clinic just outside town. Her sister had been expecting her home before 10 o'clock. When she didn't show up, they called the police. She had parked in the side lot near the dumpsters. Just a few steps from where I had stood that night, fumbling with my coat while Evan unlocked his car. I started therapy a few months after the trial ended. Not because I was having nightmares or hearing voices, just because I felt wrong. Like something had shifted under my skin and wouldn't settle back into place. My therapist told me I was dealing with survivor's guilt. That phrase never sat right with me. It felt too clean, too clinical for something so sickening. I didn't survive a tragedy. I skipped it by mistake. Sometimes I wonder what he would have done if I had said yes. Would we have made it to his car? Would he have waited until we got on the road? Or would it have happened in the alley, right behind the kitchen door, where the light barely reached? I go over that night in my head, step by step, trying to find the exact moment where things could have split off into something else. Trying to figure out how close I really came. But there's no answer. Just the echo of that voice, still lodged somewhere in my mind. I can give you a ride. I hear it when I'm walking to my car after work. I hear it when I'm home alone on quiet nights. I hear it in crowded restaurants when someone lingers too long near my table. It's not fear anymore. It's memory, etched deep into the bone, quiet and constant. A reminder that monsters don't always snarl or scream. Sometimes they speak softly. Sometimes they ask if you're okay, and sometimes they wait for you to say yes. 3 months ago, I got a letter. It was forwarded from my old apartment, postmarked from a correctional facility 2 states away. The return address had no name, just a number and a unit designation. I almost threw it away, thinking it was some mistake or a scam. But something about the envelope made me pause. It was clean. Too clean. Like it had been handled carefully. Intentionally. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just a few short lines written in block letters. I remember you. You were right to say no. I only take the ones who want to leave. I read it 3 times before I realized I was holding my breath. My fingers were shaking and I had to sit down on the floor just to keep from throwing up. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a threat. It was something worse. It was a rule. A glimpse into the logic of someone who didn't think like the rest of us. Who didn't see victims or choices. Just permissions. Paths opened or closed depending on a single word. Yes or no. I turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. No smudges, no scribbles. Just that message, perfectly centered, like it had been planned for months. I took it to the police the next day. They said the name matched an inmate in a state-run psychiatric facility, transferred there after multiple breakdowns in prison. They logged the letter as evidence, but told me not to worry. He was locked up. No visitors, no unsupervised time, no way to reach me. But the damage was already done. Not to my safety, to my certainty. I started checking the locks again. I moved my bed so it faced the door. I bought blackout curtains and a noise machine to drown out the sounds at night. But none of it worked. Because it wasn't about what might happen. It was about what already had. I had been chosen, evaluated, studied, and spared. Not because I was smart, not because I saw through the danger. Just because I said the wrong word at the right time. Now, every polite conversation with a stranger feels like a test. Every quiet waiter, every slow nod, every subtle smile. I wonder what they're thinking, what decision they're waiting for me to make. Because now I know the truth. It isn't always about danger sneaking in. Sometimes it stands across from you with a notepad and a calm voice. Sometimes it waits in silence, just long enough for you to trust it. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you walk away, without realizing you are already inside the trap, until it's too late. It's been over 15 years since I last stepped inside that house, but I can still remember the color of the carpet in the hallway and the way the second stair creaked if you put your weight too far to the left. I was 10 years old when my parents bought that place. A gray two-story on the edge of a rural cul-de-sac in northern Wisconsin. It backed into a dense strip of pine forest, which I used to love in the beginning. The air always smelled like sap and moss, and I'd lie awake at night listening to the wind move through the trees, imagining it was the sound of the ocean. The first few months there felt normal. My parents were happier than I'd ever seen them. My dad had taken a job at the local factory, and my mom worked part-time at a pharmacy in town. I spent most of my time upstairs in my bedroom, which had a small window that looked out toward the tree line. I liked to leave it cracked at night, even during winter. The cold didn't bother me. I liked how quiet it made everything. The room was simple. One twin bed, a tall wooden dresser with one drawer that stuck, and a desk that had belonged to the previous owner's son. The walls were painted pale blue, and there were faint outlines where posters must have hung before. It felt untouched, like it was ours alone. That changed around late October. The nights had grown longer, and the air inside the house always smelled faintly metallic when the heat kicked on. I started waking up at strange hours, usually right before sunrise. Not because of noise, but because of how cold it got. Even with the windows closed, I'd wake up shivering, my breath curling above me in the dark. My parents had the same model space heater in every room, but mine always seemed to fail. It would click on for a few minutes, then stop with a dull thud, like something had tripped the breaker. At first, I thought it was faulty wiring. My dad even looked at it one weekend and replaced the plug, but nothing helped. The temperature in my room kept dropping at night, and by the first week of November, I stopped sleeping altogether. I'd lie awake, wrapped in every blanket I owned, listening to the old baseboards pop as they contracted in the cold. I didn't want to complain. I was scared they'd move me into the guest room downstairs, which always smelled like wet stone. But then the dreams started. The first one came on a Sunday night. I had gone to bed around 9 o'clock, and I remember waking up suddenly, unsure if I had heard something. My room looked the same as always, except the light from the hallway was gone, and the air felt unusually dry. I could hear the wind in the trees, but it didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like low breathing, deep and rhythmic, the kind you only hear from someone who's standing just behind you in the dark. In the dream, I was lying in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to move. The breathing grew louder, closer, until I could feel the warmth of it against my cheek. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. That's when I felt it. A sudden burst of heat, like someone had lit a match inside my mattress. It started at my feet and crept upward. I tried to kick off the blankets, but my body wouldn't respond. I looked toward the door, but it was gone. There was only a solid wall where it should have been, and a thin crack glowing at the bottom, like firelight bleeding in from the other side. Then I woke up, drenched in sweat, my room colder than ever. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, and from that point forward, the dreams came more often. Every night, I'd find myself back in that bed, paralyzed, while the air around me turned thick and hot. The fire always started somewhere different. The closet, the baseboard, the desk near the window. I could smell the smoke, acrid and sharp, like burning plastic. Each time I'd wake up gasping for air, my skin clammy, my eyes stinging even though there was nothing in the room. I didn't tell my parents at first. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. But something was changing in the house, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. My mom started acting different. She used to leave the hallway light on for me at night, but she stopped after Thanksgiving. When I asked her why, she said it was wasting electricity, but her voice sounded flat, distant. She had dark circles under her eyes, and I caught her more than once standing outside my room at night, not moving, just watching the door. One evening, after dinner, I walked past her room and saw her sitting on the edge of her bed, holding a washcloth to her face. She didn't say anything when I passed, but I noticed her hands were shaking. My dad started sleeping on the couch that week. I don't think I ever asked why. The final dream came the night after my birthday. I had just turned 11, and my parents had let me stay up late to watch a movie. I remember the cake we had, store-bought chocolate with blue frosting. I fell asleep around 10 o'clock and woke up in the middle of the dream. This one was different, more vivid. The air was choked with smoke, and the room was filled with flickering light. I could hear wood splitting, paint blistering. My bed was already engulfed by the time I realized I couldn't move. I felt the heat along my arms, crawling toward my throat. That's when I saw the silhouette outside the window. Tall, unmoving, framed by the glow of the fire. It didn't try to help me. It just stood there, its head tilted, watching as I burned. When I woke up, the room was dark, but the air was hot. Not warm, hot like the heater had been running non-stop. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and clicked it on, but nothing happened. The bulb was cold. The power was out. I got up and went to the door, but it was stuck. I had to shove it open with my shoulder, and when I did, I saw my mother standing at the top of the stairs, staring into my room. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked relieved. She asked me if I had smelled anything. I told her no, but I wasn't sure that was true. The hallway did smell strange. Not smoke, exactly, but something burnt, like old wiring. My dad came up a few minutes later with a flashlight. He checked the fuse box in the basement, then told us that one of the breakers had tripped. He flipped it back on, and the lights returned, but the heater in my room never worked again. We moved out a week later. It wasn't a decision we discussed. One morning, I came home from school and saw cardboard boxes in the hallway. My mom told me we were going to stay with my uncle for a while. I asked her why, and she said the house needed repairs. I knew that wasn't true. Something had changed in her voice. Something that didn't feel like a lie, but like fear. The night before we left, I walked through every room in the house with a flashlight, just to say goodbye. When I got to my bedroom, I stopped in the doorway. The air was cold again, and the faint smell of burnt plastic had returned. I turned on the flashlight, scanned the bed, then the corners of the room, and finally, the window. That's when I saw it, a single black streak on the baseboard under the window, about the size of a coin. It looked like something had melted there. The wall around it was still cool to the touch. I didn't tell my parents. We left the next morning around 7 o'clock. My dad loaded the last of the boxes into the truck while my mom locked the front door. I remember turning around in the driveway, looking at the house one last time. The bedroom window was empty, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still inside. Watching. 3 months passed before we heard anything else about the house. We had settled into my uncle's place by then, a small ranch-style home on the far side of town. It wasn't permanent, but it felt safer somehow. I still had trouble sleeping, but the dreams had stopped. My mom seemed more herself again. She'd started cooking dinners from scratch, even humming to herself sometimes while she worked. It felt like something had been lifted. Then, one night, while we were eating dinner, the phone rang. My mom answered. I remember the way her face changed while she listened. She didn't say much, just nodded, murmured a few words, then hung up. She stood there for a moment with her back to us, staring out the kitchen window. When she finally turned around, her eyes were glassy. That call had been from our old neighbor. Apparently, there had been a fire. It started in the early hours of the morning, sometime after 3 o'clock. No one was inside. Thank God. The family who had bought the house hadn't moved in yet. The fire crew said it originated upstairs, right around the closet that connected the bedrooms. The wiring was old, and they figured a fault in the insulation had sparked it. But the strange part, the part that made my mother sit down without a word, was what the firefighters found. According to the report, the fire hadn't spread the way it should have. It burned hot and fast, but only in one room. The walls of my old bedroom were scorched from floor to ceiling. The ceiling itself had collapsed inward, the insulation above charred black. The closet door had melted into the carpet, but the rest of the house, completely untouched. No smoke damage, not even heat warping on the hallway walls. Just that one room. The fire marshal couldn't explain it. Neither could the neighbors, who said they hadn't seen flames until it was too late. One of them said it looked like the fire had already burned itself out by the time the engines arrived, as if it had known exactly what it wanted to consume. I didn't say anything that night. I just sat there, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, listening to the clock tick above the stove. My heart felt hollow in my chest, like it had been scooped out and filled with ash. Later, after my parents went to bed, I sat in the dark living room and stared at the wall, trying not to picture the heat curling around my bed sheets, the plastic blinds warping, the floor blackening under invisible flame. I kept thinking about that final dream, the figure standing at the window. It hadn't moved. It had only watched. It had waited. The years went by and we never spoke of the house again. Life moved on, as it always does. We stayed with my uncle until the spring, then moved into a smaller place across town. Nothing strange ever happened there. No cold nights, no dreams. The heater worked. The walls were silent. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt normal again. But I never stopped thinking about that room. When I got older, I tried to rationalize it. Faulty wiring, carbon monoxide, stress-induced hallucinations. All the typical explanations. I told myself I had imagined the dreams, that my memories were warped by fear. But that didn't explain the scorch mark I saw beneath the window. It didn't explain the heat I felt on my skin before the power went out. And it sure didn't explain the fire. A few years ago, I tried looking the property up online. The house was still there, listed under a different address. The exterior painted a warmer beige. The old pine trees had been trimmed back, and the bedroom window now had heavy blackout curtains. I clicked through the photos, my heart pounding. When I got to the upstairs hallway, I stopped. The closet door was missing. That entire section had been sealed over. No listing history mentioned a fire. That night, I had a dream I hadn't had in over a decade. This time, I was standing outside the house, staring up at the window. The curtains parted slightly, and behind the glass, I saw something watching me. Not a person, not exactly, just a shape. Tall, lean, framed by orange light. Its face was featureless, but I could feel its gaze. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air grew thick. Then I woke up, coughing, drenched in sweat, the sheets clinging to my skin. It hasn't come back since, but I still wonder. Was it the house itself? Was something trapped there, feeding off the heat, waiting for someone to fall asleep long enough for it to crawl in and make itself real? Or was it something older? A part of the land maybe, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I don't have the answers, but I know this much. When we moved out of that house, something stayed behind. And whatever it was, it didn't burn with the room. It didn't vanish into smoke. It waited. Maybe it still waits. Watching through that window, behind blackout curtains, framed by orange light. If someone else lives there now, I hope they keep the door shut tight. And I hope, when they dream, they don't feel the heat. I never used to think of myself as paranoid. I always trusted my gut, sure, but I wasn't the kind of person who jumped at shadows or kept a bat near the bed. That changed last October, the night everything shifted, and I stopped trusting what I thought I knew about the people around me. It started with a local warning broadcast that cut into every station around 10:40 p.m. I had been watching an old film on mute, just letting the light flicker in the background while I scrolled through my phone. Suddenly, the screen changed to a black background with white block text. No sound, just those sterile words. Local emergency notice. Shelter in place immediately. That was it. No explanation, no sirens, no voiceover. I remember feeling confused more than anything. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside a small town in the Midwest. Nothing ever happens here. We're one of those places where people leave their doors unlocked during the day, where the biggest local scandal was a bake sale theft 4 years ago. So to see a message like that, with no context, it didn't feel real. I looked out the window. My neighbors across the street were standing in their driveway, pointing toward the woods. I couldn't see what they were pointing at, but the way they moved, fast and jerky, with sudden glances over their shoulders, made me uneasy. Then I noticed something else. They weren't going back inside. They were getting in their car, throwing bags in the back seat, and peeling out of the driveway like they were fleeing a war zone. And they left their front door wide open. That part bothered me. The broadcast didn't say to evacuate. It said to shelter in place. But now 2 more cars on the block sped off in opposite directions. No sirens, no cops, just neighbors running. I stepped away from the window and locked the door, even though I almost never do. Then I checked the back door, the garage, every point of entry. I don't know why I felt the need to double-check everything, but my nerves were shot. I thought about calling someone, my brother in Chicago maybe, but decided against it. It didn't feel like something I could explain. That's when I heard a knock at the front door. One single knock. Not a series. Not someone desperate or frantic. Just one hard, deliberate knock. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone approach, and no one I knew would knock like that at this hour. My porch light was off, and I didn't have a peephole, but I edged up to the window beside the door and slowly pulled the curtain back. Standing there was a woman, maybe late 30s, dark jacket, brown hair. She wasn't someone I recognized. She just stood still, looking directly at the door like she knew I was behind it. She didn't fidget, didn't call out, just waited. I didn't move. I stayed completely still. After maybe a minute, she knocked again, just once. Then she spoke, and her voice was what set every alarm off inside me. "Hey, sorry to bother you. My car broke down a few houses down. Can I borrow your phone?" It was the way she said it. Too flat, like she'd memorized it. There was no rhythm to the words, no natural pauses, no frustration, no fear, just recitation, like a recording. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. I didn't respond, didn't breathe. I just waited. She stayed there for several minutes. I could see her shadow through the curtain, still motionless. Then, without saying anything else, she turned and walked away. That should have been the end of it, but I couldn't let it go. I watched from the upstairs window as she walked not toward the direction she said her car was, but into the wooded area behind the neighborhood. And she didn't walk like someone unfamiliar with the terrain. She moved with precision, like she knew every branch and root. I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been lost at all. I turned off every light in the house and sat in the dark, scrolling through every local thread and social media group I could find. That's when I saw it. A post on the town's emergency subreddit. Just 3 lines. "Don't answer the door tonight. Doesn't matter what they say. They're not people." That's all it said, but there were dozens of replies echoing the same thing. I kept refreshing, but new posts started getting deleted almost as soon as they went up. Users vanishing mid-conversation. One person even posted a video, brief, shaky footage of a man knocking on someone's door, then suddenly jerking his head around in a movement too fast to be human. The video cut off after that. I shut my laptop. My hands were sweating, and I felt sick to my stomach. I needed sleep, but I knew I wouldn't be able to. Around 2 in the morning, my landline rang. No one ever uses that line except my mother. I picked it up, and sure enough, her voice came through. "Honey, are you all right?" I was instantly relieved. I hadn't even told her about the alert. "Yeah, I'm okay," I said. "Just weird stuff happening here. Did you see the broadcast?" There was a pause. "What broadcast?" I explained everything, but she didn't respond. Just that same dead silence. Then, in a slightly different voice, she said, "Can you check the front window for me?" I dropped the phone. That was not my mother. It was her voice, but it came out wrong at the end. Like it skipped, like audio corrupted in a video file. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Then the phone rang again. I unplugged it. I knew I wasn't crazy. Something was happening in town. Something that could imitate voices. I spent the rest of the night curled up in the hallway between the kitchen and laundry room. No windows there. No direct lines of sight from outside. I kept the lights off and held my old aluminum bat, the one from high school, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. At dawn, I peeked through the blinds. The neighborhood looked the same. Lawns untouched, mailboxes upright, but there were no people, no cars on the road, no kids on bikes. It was a weekday, and it looked like a ghost town. I thought maybe I should make a break for it, but I still didn't know what I'd be running from or to. Around 8 o'clock, I heard another knock, but this time it came from the back door. I hadn't told anyone about what happened the night before. No one even knew I was still home. I crept to the rear hallway, heart racing, and looked through the small kitchen window toward the back porch. A man was standing there. He was clean-cut, mid-40s maybe, wearing a light brown flannel. His smile was too wide. He waved. "Hey, I think we might be neighbors. You okay in there?" I didn't answer. He stepped closer. "You left your back light on. Just wanted to let you know." That was a lie. Every light in the house was off. I double-checked. I backed away from the window, stomach turning. The man didn't knock again. He just stood there for maybe 10 more minutes before casually walking off toward the side of the house. I locked myself in the bathroom and turned the water on to mask sound. I sat on the floor trying to steady my breathing. Then I got a text from a coworker named Rena. "Hey, weird question. Did you see anything weird last night?" I responded immediately, thankful for the connection. "Yes, a lot. You?" Her reply came fast. "Yeah, I'm across town. Something's really wrong here." We texted for a while. She described someone knocking on her door too, pretending to be her brother. Then she asked me something that stopped me cold. "What was the name of the dog I told you I had growing up?" I paused. She never had a dog. I stared at the screen, heart thudding. I replied, "You didn't have one. You're allergic." Her response took a minute. Then it came. "Good. Just checking." We didn't talk much after that. We agreed to check in once a day at sunset, just to make sure the other was still alive. I stayed inside for 2 more days. By the 3rd day, power was gone. Water pressure vanished. My food supply was dwindling. And on the 4th night, someone unlocked my front door. I had bolted it. I had even pushed a dresser against it. But at 3:15 a.m., I heard the click, and the hinges creaked. I stepped into the hallway with the bat raised, but no one came in. The door slowly opened partway. No wind, no footsteps, just stillness. Then a voice whispered from the dark, "You dropped your bat last night. Here it is." But I was holding it. I didn't sleep at all after that. I moved into the attic that night, not because it was safer, but because it had only one entrance, a pull-down ladder. I figured if anything came for me, I'd at least hear it first. That was my new metric for hope. Not survival, just knowing ahead of time. I brought up a few cans of soup, a bottle of water, a flashlight, and the bat. I used an old blanket to block the tiny attic window. Then I waited. I don't know how long I stayed up there, maybe 2 full days. I started hearing voices around the 2nd night, not from outside, from below me. They weren't yelling or even talking loud, they just whispered, like a group of people having a quiet conversation directly beneath the ceiling. Sometimes it sounded like my voice. Other times it was Rena's. I knew it wasn't her. I hadn't heard from her since the 3rd night. Then one morning, silence. Complete silence. No wind, no birds, no creaking of wood. Just dead air. I cracked the window and peeked outside. The sky was overcast, but there was light. Enough to see. And someone was standing in my yard. I recognized them immediately. It was my father. Only he'd been dead for 12 years. He was facing away from the house, arms limp at his sides, not moving, just standing there, wearing the same flannel he'd worn the year before his heart gave out. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me, just stood in the yard like a lawn ornament. I watched him until nightfall. Eventually, I opened the window and called out, "Why are you here?" His head twitched, almost like a glitch in a video. Then he turned, slowly, not all at once, and smiled. But his teeth were wrong. They were all the same size, too small, like he had a row of baby teeth. And then he whispered, "You let me in once, let me in again." That broke something inside me. I closed the window and started crying. The quiet kind, with your chest tight and your face numb. When I finally looked back out, he was gone. I left the attic at dawn, armed myself with a kitchen knife I found still clean in the drying rack, and walked out the front door. No one stopped me. No one was outside. Just the distant hum of something electric, deep beneath the ground. I walked 6 miles to the edge of town. Every house was empty. Every yard looked frozen in time. Eventually, a black van pulled up behind me on the road. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out and offered me a ride without introducing themselves. I got in. I knew better than to ask where we were going. I live in a new place now. No phones, no internet. But every few nights, I hear knocking. Always just one knock, never followed by another. I never answer, and I never will. I used to keep the TV on at night for background noise. It helped me feel less alone in the apartment, especially after moving to that high-rise in Midtown. The building was modern, but something about it always felt sterile, like it had no history, no warmth, just drywall, glass, and thin walls. I had gotten off a late shift that Thursday. It was just past 11 o'clock when I got home. I threw my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and microwaved some leftover rice and steamed vegetables, the usual routine. I didn't feel like checking my phone or answering texts, so I left it in my coat pocket. I just wanted to eat, watch something light, and crash. I ended up falling asleep with the TV still on. That wasn't unusual for me, but what happened when I woke up still doesn't sit right. I remember opening my eyes to a dim flicker across the ceiling. The room was completely quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The TV had gone to a black screen with a rotating symbol in the corner, a circle with 3 white bars that pulsed in and out. At first, I thought the cable had cut out, but the volume was still on. I realized the sound was just silence. No menu, no static, no channel info. Just that strange, rotating logo, like a loading screen that never finished. I sat up slowly, rubbing the side of my face. I checked the clock on the oven in the kitchen. It was just past 3 o'clock. My first thought was to turn off the television and go to bed properly. I reached for the remote, but the screen changed before I could press anything. The symbol disappeared. In its place was a black and white aerial shot of a highway intersection, filmed from above like a traffic camera. The feed was grainy and flickering, but I could still make out the familiar layout. It looked like the split near the East Avenue exit, not far from where I used to take the bus. There was no narration, no music, just the faint crackle of audio static behind the image. I kept watching, waiting for something to happen. After maybe 20 seconds, a small banner appeared at the bottom. It read, "Surveillance Review, Segment B." Then, a date, October 14th. That was the same day. I thought maybe it was some public access program, or a late-night city surveillance review. But the footage kept cutting to different camera angles, each time showing empty streets or intersections, with little to no traffic. Some of the locations looked familiar, others didn't. But the banner kept updating with the same label, Segment B, followed by the same date. Then the voice started. A soft male voice, flat and measured, almost like someone reading off a spreadsheet. There was no inflection, no emotion, just names, one by one. I remember hearing the first name, Darren Kelly, then a pause, then another, Ruth Ann Miller. The voice kept going, slow and deliberate, as if confirming attendance at a meeting. The names were ordinary. No titles, no context, just names. At first I assumed it was a list of local traffic citations or accident reports, but the more I listened, the stranger it felt. The list didn't stop. It went on and on, name after name, always with the same calm pacing. I started feeling uneasy. I muted the TV for a moment, thinking I could clear my head. But even with no sound, the screen kept showing aerial traffic shots while the banner continued updating. It didn't feel like a recording anymore. It felt active, like it was live. I was about to power off the television entirely when I saw a name flash across the bottom of the screen. It was mine, not just my first name, my full name, spelled correctly, not a common variant. The same name on my lease, my bank account, my ID. I stared at the screen, unmoving. The voice was still muted, but I swore I could hear it in my head, saying my name just as it had the others. I unmuted the TV, but the voice had already moved on. 2 more names had been read. I reached for my phone, suddenly needing to check the date, the time, anything. I needed proof that I wasn't dreaming, but my phone was still dead in my coat pocket. The list kept going for another 2 minutes. Then, the camera angle switched one last time. A top-down view of an empty intersection near Ridge Parkway, where a late-night bus route used to run. I recognized the overpass by the graffiti on the guardrail. The voice paused, then said something that froze me in place. Pending. Estimated casualty projection, 13. Segment concluded. The screen went black. No signal icon, no credits, no channel logo, just a soft clicking sound like the end of a VHS tape. Then silence. The rotating symbol returned for maybe 10 seconds before the TV shut itself off. I didn't move for a long time. My heart was beating so hard it made my stomach hurt. The apartment felt colder than it should have. I checked the thermostat. It hadn't changed, but the air felt off, stale and still, like the room had stopped breathing. I told myself it was some weird experimental broadcast or a hacked channel feed, that it had to be a fluke, a mistake, a prank, maybe. I even convinced myself that I'd misread the name, that it wasn't really mine. But I knew better. I had seen it, clear as day. That morning, I didn't go to work. I emailed my supervisor and said I was sick. I felt nauseous anyway. I spent the whole day checking local news sites and Reddit threads to see if anyone had seen the same thing. But there was nothing. No mentions of the broadcast, no footage, not even a single comment. I started wondering if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe I dozed off and had some vivid dream while the TV played in the background. That seemed reasonable enough, but around 5 o'clock that evening, I got a text from my old coworker, Denise. We hadn't spoken in weeks. Her message was short, just a screenshot of a local news alert with the words, "Multiple fatalities in Ridge Parkway overpass collision. Late-night bus struck by runaway SUV." I read it twice. My stomach dropped. The image attached to the article looked almost identical to the last camera angle from the broadcast. I could even make out the edge of the same graffiti along the guardrail. I didn't reply to Denise. I didn't know what to say. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with all the lights on, staring at the unplugged TV. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence. But the names, the location, the number. I stayed home the next day too, and the next. I didn't eat much. I kept the television off, the volume muted, and my curtains drawn. Every sound from the hallway made my skin crawl. Every creak from the pipes made my hands sweat. By the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a small bag and took the train upstate to stay with my brother. I told him I needed a break from the city. He didn't ask questions. He never does. But I didn't tell him why. I couldn't. Not without sounding insane. I've been here for a week now. The apartment is quiet, clean, and surrounded by trees. It should feel peaceful, but I haven't slept more than a few hours a night. Every time I close my eyes, I see that list scrolling down the screen. I hear that voice, calm, cold, certain, saying names. Sometimes when I check the news, I see stories that match some of the ones from the footage. Pedestrian struck, head-on collision. Names that I remember from the broadcast, listed among the victims. Not always the same location, but always something avoidable. Always something preventable. I don't know what I saw. I don't know why my name was on that list, or why the projection never happened to me. But I can't shake the feeling that I was supposed to be on that bus. That something made me stay home for a reason. And now I'm afraid that whatever spared me once might not do it again. My brother's house is one of those places where everything feels a little too quiet. No passing cars, no late-night footsteps in the hallway above. Just the occasional rustle of wind through pine trees and the low hum of the refrigerator cycling every few hours. It was peaceful, but it wasn't restful. I'd lie awake until 4 or 5 o'clock every morning, then drift off for a few shallow hours right before the sun came up. The only time I really felt alert was late at night. That was when the memory of the broadcast started clawing at the edges of my brain again. Not just what I saw, but what I hadn't seen. The names I couldn't remember. The ones that sounded familiar, but slipped away before I could write them down. Every night, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, watching the reflection of the microwave clock on the floor tiles, trying to convince myself that the whole thing had been a mistake. One night, I think it was the 6th or 7th since I'd arrived, I was scrolling through local news sites again. I couldn't stop checking. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to prove it had been a coincidence. But part of me was looking for patterns. I didn't realize how obsessed I'd gotten until I found myself cross-referencing accident locations with names I thought I remembered from the broadcast. I had a list scribbled down in a notebook. Just a few names. Most were half remembered. Some I'd written phonetically. One of them, Elise Warren, stood out. It wasn't until I searched her name and found a recent obituary that I froze. The article was short. It mentioned a fatal kitchen fire in a downtown apartment. The time of death was listed as 3:15 in the morning, the same night I'd seen the broadcast. There was no reason for her name to stick out more than the others. I didn't know her. I'd never met anyone by that name, but I knew I'd heard it. I could still hear the voice saying it, as calm as ever. Elise Warren. Then the pause, then the next. That was the moment I realized I had to go back to the city. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought I could find a copy of the broadcast or prove it had been some elaborate hoax, but there was something else too. A growing suspicion that it hadn't been random, that it had been meant for me. I didn't tell my brother I was leaving. I packed my bag early in the morning and caught the 9 o'clock train back to Midtown. I felt sick the whole way down. I couldn't stop looking at my reflection in the train window. My face looked thinner. My eyes had dark rings under them. I looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. When I got back to my apartment, everything was exactly how I'd left it. The curtains were still drawn. The dishes were still in the sink. But the air felt wrong again. Stale, like it hadn't been breathed in days. I opened a window and turned on the lights, trying to force the place to feel normal again. The television remote was still sitting on the armrest of the couch. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. I pressed the power button and waited. The screen lit up, showing a regular afternoon news broadcast. Something about a city council meeting and a funding proposal. Ordinary stuff. I changed the channel twice just to make sure. Everything was back to normal. But I couldn't relax. I didn't sleep that night either. I left the TV on, but the volume low. Around 2:45, the screen flickered for a second. Not a full cutout, just a momentary stutter, like a skipped frame on a DVD. I sat up immediately. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I muted the volume and watched the screen like a hawk. But nothing happened. The broadcast continued like normal. No strange symbols, no aerial footage. By 4 o'clock, I gave up and shut it off. I sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city below. My building wasn't high enough to avoid street noise. I could still hear the occasional siren or distant honk. But that night, it felt different, like the sounds were coming from deeper underground. Not from outside the window, but from somewhere beneath the building. The next 2 nights passed without incident. I stayed up both times, waiting for a sign, but the broadcast never returned. No names, no voice, just regular late-night programming and early morning infomercials. By the 3rd day, I convinced myself it was done. Whatever it was, it had passed. Maybe I'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe I'd narrowly escaped something I wasn't meant to see. I almost started to feel normal again. I went back to work. I answered texts. I made small talk with my coworkers and told them I'd been sick with a bad stomach bug. Nobody questioned it. Life began to inch forward again, until I got the envelope. It arrived without a return address. Plain white envelope. No stamps. Just my name, written in block letters. No apartment number, just the building address. It had been slid under my door while I was out. The edges were damp, like it had been left in the rain. Inside was a single printed sheet. A still image from a traffic camera, black and white, time-stamped. The same intersection from the Ridge Parkway footage. And at the bottom of the image, 3 words typed in all caps, Segment C, pending. I sat on the kitchen floor holding that piece of paper for over 20 minutes. My ears were ringing. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept glancing toward the TV like it might flicker back to life at any second. It didn't. I threw the image into the trash, then pulled it back out and burned it over the kitchen sink with a lighter. I don't know what I thought that would accomplish. Maybe I just didn't want proof anymore. Maybe part of me believed that destroying it might break the cycle. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. That night, the silence in the apartment was unbearable. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. I just kept staring at the blank screen. The voice didn't come back, but the dread did. It wrapped itself around me like a second skin. And when I finally collapsed into bed around 5 o'clock, I had the worst dream I've ever had. I was standing in the middle of a road. It was raining. The sky was a pale gray, but everything around me looked bleached and colorless. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. Just ahead of me, a long list of names scrolled down a translucent screen that hovered in the air. I could read every name clearly, but I couldn't remember any of them when I woke up. At the bottom of the list, just before it faded, was one word, confirmed. When I opened my eyes, it was still dark out. I was sweating through my shirt. My pillow felt damp, and my jaw was sore from grinding my teeth. I checked the time on the oven clock. It was 4:55, 5 minutes before sunrise. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street below. The cars looked normal, the people looked normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not after everything, not after what I'd seen, and not after what I knew was coming. Because in the days that followed, I started noticing small changes. News headlines that lined up with names I thought I remembered. Minor incidents. A construction worker crushed by scaffolding. A cyclist hit by a delivery van. A teacher who collapsed in front of her class. Not enough to draw attention on a national scale. But all of them had one thing in common. They happened at intersections. Most during odd hours, and all were captured by traffic cameras. I started making another list. Not of the names, but of the locations. I cross-checked news stories with city planning records. I even started mapping the intersections by hand. It became an obsession, a ritual. I needed to know if there was a pattern, if segment C meant something, if I was supposed to stop it, or witness it, or be part of it. I don't go out at night anymore. Not after what happened last Tuesday. I was on my way back from a work meeting and took a different route home. The train was delayed, so I got off early and walked the last 8 blocks. At one point, I passed a small surveillance box mounted to a lamppost. One of those nondescript gray cylinders with a blinking red light. I'd seen dozens before, but this one buzzed as I passed. Not loudly, just enough to notice. Then the red light went solid, not blinking, steady. I stopped. My chest tightened. The air around me felt thick, like it was pushing against my ears. I turned around and walked the rest of the way home without looking back. That night, I unplugged the television. I shut the blinds. I covered the small camera on my laptop with a piece of tape. I don't know if it helped, but it felt like something I could control. Now, every night, I wait. I sit in the dark with my notebook, writing down names I think I remember. Places that sound familiar, headlines that make my heart skip, and I keep the TV off, always off. But I still hear the voice, not through the speakers, not in my dreams. It's like a memory I can't forget, a song I never learned but somehow know, saying the names over and over. And I know mine is still on that list. Maybe not confirmed yet, but waiting, pending. It's been 22 days since I saw the broadcast. I know because I've been marking the calendar with red pen circles. Not because I'm counting down to anything, but because I'm terrified of forgetting. I'm afraid that if I lose track, even for a day, the pattern might change. Or worse, I might stop noticing altogether. I haven't been back to work in over a week. I told them my leave was for mental health reasons. I don't know if they believed me. I don't really care. My days are split between trying to stay calm and trying to anticipate what might come next. The list of names in my notebook is now 7 pages long. Most of them I can't confirm. Some don't appear in the news at all. Others show up days later in local obituaries or accident reports. But it's the ones that never appear. The names that seem to vanish into thin air, that keep me up at night. I can't explain how I know, but I'm starting to believe the broadcast doesn't predict events. It assigns them, like a roster, a queue. Each name belongs to a specific moment in time, and once it's spoken, the rest is just logistics. I've tried reaching out anonymously online. I've posted on message boards, shared vague descriptions, even created a burner account to ask if anyone else had ever seen something like it. Most responses were trolls or skeptics. A few people shared stories of strange late-night programming, but nothing matched exactly. Except one. It was buried in the replies. A user named Latency5 responded with a single line. Segment D scheduled, 12 o'clock, Western Overpass. Don't be there. That was it. No follow-up, no explanation. I messaged the account directly. No response. The profile was deleted a day later, but the message stuck with me. It was the first time I'd seen someone use the same terminology. Segment, without me bringing it up first. I wrote it down and stared at it for hours. Western Overpass, 12 o'clock. I knew the spot. It wasn't far from the grocery store I used to walk to, a narrow bridge with just 2 lanes and no shoulder. Always busy during lunch hours. I hadn't been there in months, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. The following Wednesday I made the decision to go. Not to intervene, not to stop anything, just to see. To prove to myself that I hadn't lost touch with reality, I needed something concrete. Even if it scared me, even if it confirmed my worst fears. I left the apartment just after 11:30, dressed plainly, no phone, no ID, just a small notebook in my jacket pocket and a pair of sunglasses. The sun was bright, almost too bright. The sky was cloudless and the sidewalks buzzed with midday foot traffic. It should have been comforting, but everything felt muted, like I was moving through a simulation. When I reached the overpass, I found a bench under a shade tree across the street and sat down. I kept my eyes on the road, watching each car as it passed. 12 o'clock came and went. Nothing happened. For several minutes, I felt like a fool, like I'd chased a ghost into the light of day. But then I noticed a delivery van parked just before the incline. Engine running, hazard lights on. The driver was standing next to it, on the phone, gesturing toward a flat tire. It wasn't unusual, but then I noticed something else. A cyclist swerving to avoid the van, clipping the edge of the curb and tumbling forward. She hit the ground hard but scrambled up quickly. A few passers-by ran over to help. Nothing fatal, no real harm done. but it happened right at 12 o'clock, exactly where the bridge narrowed. It wasn't the scale of the incident that disturbed me. It was the precision, the small detail, the way every part seemed to fall into place, like the chain of events had been rehearsed. The cyclist, the tire, the bystanders, a minor disruption. But what if she hadn't swerved in time? What if the next segment escalated? I walked home in a daze. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying it in my head, over and over. That moment of near impact. The sense that the broadcast didn't just report the future. It crafted it, shaped it, subtly, inevitably. The next morning, I made a choice I never thought I would. I decided to document everything. Not just the events, but the feelings, the patterns, the images, the voice. I didn't trust digital files, so I started handwriting each entry. I described the original broadcast. The still images, the voice's cadence, the terminology. Segment A, segment B, now C and D. I even tried to replicate the visual. A rotating symbol in the corner of a screen, white bars pulsing in a slow rhythm. I drew it from memory. At first, I thought I was just preserving details, but as I kept drawing, I noticed something. Each bar in the symbol had small tick marks, almost like tiny lines of code. They weren't decorative. They looked intentional, like part of a signal. That realization made my chest tighten. I started to wonder if I'd been marked in some way. Not watched, not followed, but designated. Pulled into a system that didn't need my permission to operate. Something bureaucratic in its coldness, efficient, mechanical. A few days later, I found a flash drive taped to my mailbox. No note, no label. I brought it inside using a napkin, plugged it into an old laptop I never used anymore, and waited. It contained a single file, a video. 34 seconds long, grainy, low resolution, but unmistakable. It showed the cyclist on the overpass, the fall, the crowd, the timestamp, segment D, and in the corner, that same symbol, rotating, pulsing, watching. I watched it once, then erased the drive and smashed it with a hammer, but the damage was done. Someone, or something, had recorded the event before it happened, or had orchestrated it so precisely that it could be recorded in advance. Either way, it confirmed what I feared most. The broadcast wasn't just a fluke. It was part of a system, and I was inside it. I don't leave the apartment anymore. I get groceries delivered and slide tips under the door. I've covered all the cameras. I don't turn on the television, not even during the day. I've even stopped using my laptop. Everything I need, I write by hand. Names, places, dates, symbols. But I'm running out of space, and I'm running out of time. Because 2 nights ago, just past 3 o'clock, the television turned itself on. The screen was blank at first, then the symbol appeared. Just for a few seconds, no sound, no voice, just the image, flickering faintly. And then a new word appeared beneath it, a word I hadn't seen before, one that made my stomach twist so violently I thought I might pass out. Finalization, that was it. No segment, no list, just the word. Finalization. I don't know what it means, but I don't think it's a coincidence that it came after I started documenting things. After I started piecing together the system, I think it means I've reached the end of whatever process I was pulled into. And I think the next name on the list won't be a stranger. It will be mine. So I'm writing this now, all of it, not as a warning, but as a record. For whoever finds it, for whoever might be next. I've destroyed every electronic device I own. This account will exist only on paper. No uploads, no files, no emails, just ink and memory. Because the broadcast can't be stopped. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't want followers. It wants order, sequence. Names spoken in the right tone, at the right time, in the right place. And once your name is spoken, you belong to it. I used to think that staying home would protect me, that if I kept the lights on and avoided intersections, I'd be safe. But it doesn't matter where you are. The signal finds you. Through screens, through words, through the places we forget to question. If you're reading this now, maybe you've seen the symbol. Maybe you've heard the voice. Maybe you've just been waiting for someone else to confirm that you're not crazy, that it's real. Well, it is. And if you hear your name next, don't look for answers. Don't try to escape. Just understand that the broadcast doesn't choose randomly. It chooses with precision. You were always meant to be next. It's strange what the brain holds on to when everything else fades. I don't remember the moment my car left the road, but I remember the seconds before. The sun was in my eyes, low and golden, filtering through the windshield in that late autumn haze. I remember thinking I was almost home. I had just finished a 16-hour shift at the refinery and was looking forward to warming up leftover stew. That was it. Then everything split into noise, metal, and weightlessness. The next thing I remember was silence. Not darkness, just a kind of nothingness, like I had been placed in a room without walls or air. I couldn't open my eyes, but I could think. That realization alone was terrifying. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't dreaming. I was awake, locked inside myself. At first, I thought maybe I was paralyzed, but I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anything at all. There was no sensation of lying on a bed or floor. Just thought, just fear. I don't know how long I was in that state. It could have been minutes, it could have been days. Eventually, though, I became aware of something shifting. It didn't feel like waking up. It felt more like I was being watched. There was no voice, no footsteps, no specific direction, but the feeling of being observed pressed down on me. It wasn't like someone standing in the room. It was deeper than that. Like something inside the space with me had finally noticed I was awake. That's when I heard the bell. It was faint, almost too faint to register, like a metal clapper swinging once inside a long hallway. The sound was followed by a vibration, like an engine warming up far beneath my feet. Slowly, the stillness gave way to movement, and for the first time, I had the sensation of standing, of existing in a body again. But the place wasn't familiar. I was inside what looked like an old underground tram station. The air was damp. The lights were weak, casting a flickering orange glow across cracked tile and dusty rails. There was a bench beside me, one of those warped wooden ones, the kind with iron legs rusted at the base. Behind the bench, a wall of tiled advertisements hung crooked on a discolored surface. I scanned the platform. No one. Not even a mouse. Across the tracks was a second platform, just as lifeless. A sign above the archway read, West Terminal, but the paint had peeled and the name was barely legible. The entire place looked like it hadn't seen real use in decades. Then I noticed something strange. Even though I was breathing, I couldn't see my breath. And even though my boots echoed when I stepped forward, there was no reverberation. The sound stopped instantly, as though the air swallowed it. I walked closer to the edge of the platform and looked into the tunnel. Pitch black. I took a step back. Then the train arrived. There was no warning, no squeal of brakes, just a flash of light inside the tunnel, and suddenly it was there, motionless. The cars were metallic, windowless, with riveted seams and no markings. The doors opened silently. I looked inside. The interior was dim, but I could make out empty seats. Rows of them, clean, upholstered, perfectly symmetrical. I didn't feel fear at first, just confusion. The rational part of my mind told me it was a dream, that I was probably in a hospital bed somewhere, drugged out of my skull, and this was my brain's way of processing trauma. So I stepped in. The doors closed behind me with barely a whisper. There were no advertisements on the walls, no polls, no announcements, just the gentle hum of machinery. I picked a seat near the middle of the car and sat down. The fabric was cool, and I felt its texture. Scratchy, synthetic. That detail stuck with me. I ran my hand across it again. It was too real. After a few minutes, the train began to move. Not quickly. It rolled forward with a low, mechanical rhythm that reminded me of those old diesel engines. The overhead lights buzzed, the hum in the walls grew louder. I tried to peer out the window, but the glass was too dark to see through. It reflected only the inside of the train, my face distorted by the curvature. I sat like that for a long time. I don't know how long. My sense of time was gone. There were no clocks, no other passengers, just the sensation of movement and that constant hum. Eventually, the train slowed. There was no jolt, no announcement. It simply drifted to a stop. I stood up and walked toward the door, expecting to hear something over the speakers. A voice, a chime, anything. But there was nothing. The door slid open, and I stepped out onto another platform. This one was different. The lights were out. Only a few weak fluorescents buzzed overhead, casting sickly green shadows across the concrete. Water dripped somewhere nearby. The smell was stronger here, musty, like mold and engine oil. I walked along the edge of the platform, listening to the train behind me, half expecting it to disappear once I looked away, but it stayed there. Doors open, waiting. I found another bench farther down. This one was missing a leg and leaned against the wall. Beside it, an old map was bolted into the tile. I brushed the dust away with my sleeve and squinted. It showed a series of stops, but most of the names were scratched out or covered with graffiti. Only the final station was intact. It was labeled, "End of the line." As I stared at it, the speakers above me crackled. A low, garbled voice filtered through, barely understandable, but unmistakable in its message. Next stop, final destination, end of the line. The voice didn't sound like a recording. It had weight to it. Texture. I felt it in my chest. Something about the way it was said triggered something primal. I turned toward the train and started walking backward. That's when I saw the first shape. It was across the platform, inside the tunnel I had come from. At first, I thought it was a maintenance worker. The figure stood completely still, just past the edge of the light. Then I noticed there was no reflection, no shine on the boots, no flashlight. The thing wasn't standing. It was crouched. Its posture was too low, too tense, like it was preparing to leap. I froze. For a second, it didn't move. Then the lights flickered, and when they came back on, it was gone. The tunnel was empty again. I ran for the train. The moment I stepped inside, the door shut behind me, louder than before. The seats were still empty. The lights still hummed. But the atmosphere had changed. It felt denser, more enclosed. I sat back in the same seat and tried to control my breathing. The train pulled away. This time, the movement was faster, less smooth. The hum turned into a low roar as the walls of the tunnel blurred past. I pressed my hand against the window and felt a vibration that hadn't been there before, like something running just beneath the surface. Then I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first. Not inside the car, but above me, on the roof. Each step landed with a hollow thud, deliberate and slow. I tilted my head back, listening. There was no ceiling hatch, no reason for anyone to be up there. But the steps continued, crossing from one end of the car to the other. They stopped above my seat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Every muscle in my body locked in place. Then something scraped across the metal. A dragging sound, sharp and slow. I thought about running to the other end of the car, but I couldn't bring myself to stand. The fear was too thick, like syrup in my lungs. I clenched the armrests and shut my eyes. The lights flickered again. When I opened them, the car was no longer empty. A man sat 3 seats down from me. I hadn't heard him enter. He didn't look like someone who belonged there. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his body, and his shoes were covered in thick, dark sludge. He was staring at the floor, motionless, breathing shallow. His skin was too pale. I swallowed hard and looked straight ahead. The lights dimmed again, just for a second. When they returned to full brightness, there were 2 more people seated behind him. One of them was a woman with wet hair draped across her face. The other was a boy, maybe 8 years old, wearing a school uniform that looked 3 decades old. None of them moved. I counted my breaths. By the time we reached the next station, the car was almost full. Every passenger had that same vacant stare. Waterlogged clothing, silent mouths. No one made a sound. No one looked at me. But I knew, without question, that they weren't alive. The train slowed. My heart thundered. I didn't wait for the doors to open. I jumped to my feet, grabbed the nearest pole, and braced myself as the train came to a stop. The platform outside was shrouded in mist. I didn't care. The moment the doors opened, I ran. The cold hit me instantly. As I leapt onto the platform, the air felt heavier, thicker, and colder than before. It had the smell of wet stone and rusted metal, and every breath carried the sting of something old, like damp concrete that had never fully dried. I turned back to look at the train, but the windows were now black. No reflections, no figures, just void. The doors closed slowly behind me, but they made no sound. The lights inside dimmed until they were gone entirely. And then, as if on cue, the train pulled away. It didn't accelerate, it just drifted back into the dark tunnel, swallowed without a trace. I stood alone on the platform, the mist curling around my ankles. Unlike the last station, this one had no signs, no maps, no graffiti. The walls were made of coarse stone, uneven and dark with moisture. The only light came from a few bare bulbs mounted above the platform, swaying gently even though there was no wind. I called out. My voice bounced once off the wall, then disappeared. The sound was muffled, like it couldn't travel beyond a few feet. I tried again, louder. The echo died even faster. The acoustics didn't make sense. It was like shouting underwater. I walked along the platform, trying to find an exit. Every step felt heavier. My boots left dark prints on the slick surface, and I could hear the soft squelch of water beneath the soles. At the far end of the platform, I found a staircase. The steps were narrow and steep, carved into the stone like they'd been added long after the platform was built. They twisted upward, vanishing into darkness. There were no handrails, no lights, just the wet walls and the sound of dripping water somewhere above me. I hesitated, but the idea of staying on that platform felt worse than whatever waited above. I started climbing. Each step felt longer than the last. The walls closed in as I ascended, and before long, I had to hunch forward to keep from hitting my head. The moisture turned into trickles, then rivulets, as if the stairwell was leaking. The stone beneath my feet grew slick, and more than once, I nearly slipped. After what felt like half an hour, I reached a landing. It opened into a narrow corridor lined with decaying posters. The paper had yellowed, peeled at the edges, and most of the ink had faded. I brushed one with the back of my hand and watched it disintegrate into wet flakes. The hallway smelled of mildew and something else, a coppery odor that clung to the air like dried blood. At the far end, I saw a door. It looked like an emergency exit. Heavy steel, painted red, though the paint was chipped and streaked with rust. I pushed on it with my shoulder, and to my surprise, it opened. What lay beyond wasn't a street or stairwell. It wasn't a parking lot or city block. It was another station. But this one was different. It was lit. Fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a pale, sterile glow over the tile. The station was empty, but not abandoned. It was clean, too clean. The floor had a wax sheen. The walls were white. The benches were new. A vending machine hummed near the wall, its screen blinking the word "welcome" over and over. It looked like any other modern underground station, except there were no entrances. I walked the entire length of the platform and couldn't find a staircase, an escalator, or even a service hatch. There were no turnstiles, no ticket booths. The entire station existed without access points, suspended in isolation. The only direction I could go was forward. I passed the vending machine, resisting the urge to test it, and followed a curved hallway that led to a secondary platform. This one was narrower, and at the end of it, another train waited. It was different from the first. This one was sleek, like a modern high-speed rail. Silver siding, bright interior lights, clear windows, but the doors didn't open. I approached slowly, watching the interior through the glass. There were people inside, at least a dozen, all seated, all silent. They didn't move, didn't talk. Most of them were staring straight ahead. A few had their heads tilted to the side as if listening to something just out of range. Their expressions were blank, but their eyes were wide open, alert, waiting. I tapped the glass. None of them reacted. Then I saw her. She was seated in the second car, close to the window. A girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. She wore a light blue raincoat and held a plastic toy in her lap. I recognized it. It was the kind you get from those supermarket vending machines. Cheap, colorful, shaped like a dog. I knew it because I had bought the same one for my niece the previous summer. The girl raised her head slowly and looked directly at me. My hand dropped away from the glass. Her eyes were bloodshot, but not in a medical way. The whites had turned a dull gray, and her pupils were so dilated they swallowed the color. She stared at me without blinking. Then she smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that didn't match her age. It felt rehearsed, mechanical, a smile performed, not felt. I took a step back. The door to the train slid open with a soft hiss. I didn't move. Every instinct in my body told me not to enter. Not this time. Whatever this was, it wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. I was somewhere I didn't belong, and I needed to find a way out before that door closed again. I turned and walked back down the platform. Halfway there, the lights above me began to flicker. The hallway that had been so bright seconds ago dimmed until only the outlines remained. I picked up my pace, heading back toward the red door. It was gone. Where it had been was now a solid wall. No seams, no hinges, just tile. Panic set in. I turned back toward the train. The girl in the raincoat was standing in the open doorway now, watching me. Her toy dangled from one hand. The other arm hung limp at her side. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she just stared. Then the lights went out completely. Total blackness. I dropped to the ground, arms over my head, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The silence stretched on. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Just the sound of blood in my skull and the distant hum of the train's engine. Then a sound cut through the dark. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was more like a whisper layered over static. Words formed, but they came from inside my own head. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was familiar. It was mine. That's when I remembered the crash. The weight of it returned all at once. The steering wheel, the broken glass, the flash of trees before everything went black. My body had gone into shock. I was bleeding out. Somewhere far away, a machine was keeping my heart beating. I wasn't in a dream. I was in between. That realization paralyzed me. I felt the truth of it settle over my skin like frost. I wasn't asleep, I wasn't dead, but I wasn't alive either. I had fallen into the cracks of consciousness, and something else lived here, something that wanted me to stay. The light snapped back on. I was alone again. The girl was gone. The train had disappeared. The platform was empty, except for the mirror. It hadn't been there before. It stood near the far wall, tall and narrow, framed in iron. Its surface was flawless. I saw my own face reflected back at me. Pale, gaunt, with dark smudges under both eyes. My lips were dry, my clothes soaked. I reached out and touched the surface. It was warm. The mirror shimmered slightly, like water disturbed by a breeze. I felt a pull, gentle at first, then stronger. My fingertips passed through the glass. Behind the mirror, I saw a hospital bed. Monitors, tubes. A figure lying motionless under a thin white blanket. A woman sat beside the bed, her hands clenched. She was crying. The man in the bed was me. I stared at my own face, pale and sunken, barely recognizable. The machines beeped in rhythm. The heart monitor blipped steadily, but the line was thin, weak, fading. The pull from the mirror grew stronger. I had a choice: go through, return to a broken body, a long recovery, maybe even permanent damage, or stay. Here, in this place where time didn't move, where pain didn't reach, where the dead waited in silence, watching. The voice returned. Not mine this time, not familiar. "You were almost there," it whispered. "One more stop." I stepped back from the mirror. The air grew colder. The platform dimmed again, and in the darkness, I saw the girl. She was sitting on the bench now, swinging her legs. The toy dog rested in her lap, her head tilted slowly, eyes locked onto mine. Then she spoke, in a voice that didn't match her size or age. You shouldn't have left the train." I didn't answer the girl. I couldn't. My throat felt dry, my body rooted to the tiles beneath me. The overhead lights had faded to a dull glow, just enough to cast long shadows that bent and stretched across the walls. The girl remained still, perched on that bench, eyes unblinking. I took a step back, then another. She didn't follow. I turned and walked along the edge of the platform, ignoring the dread curling in my stomach. There had to be another way out. Another mirror, another train, something. But as I searched, the station seemed to shift around me. Corners that should have led to open hallways now ended in blank walls. Benches vanished. The vending machine was gone. Only the girl remained. Her presence pressed in from behind, like gravity, even though I refused to turn around. Her words echoed in my head again, too clearly to ignore. "You shouldn't have left the train." I started running. No destination, no plan, just the desperate need to move. My boots hit the tile in erratic rhythms as the platform twisted around me like a maze. New walls formed where open paths had been seconds before. I turned corner after corner until I reached a staircase. It was narrow and steep, just like the first one. I didn't hesitate. I took the stairs two at a time, hands brushing the cold, damp walls. My breath came in sharp bursts. The farther I climbed, the warmer the air became. The stone gave way to plaster, then paint. Then I smelled disinfectant, antiseptic, the smell of a hospital. The stairwell ended abruptly. A white door stood in front of me, clean, labeled recovery in block letters. I opened it, and I was in a hospital hallway. Everything was suddenly too bright. The overhead lights buzzed softly, the floors gleamed. I heard the murmur of distant conversation, the shuffle of shoes, the beep of machines. Nurses moved in and out of rooms, none of them noticing me. I was back. I stood in that hallway for a long time, shaking. Then I heard my name. It came from the room at the end of the corridor. I walked toward it slowly, heart pounding, hands trembling. Inside, my body lay beneath white sheets, thin and still. The woman who had been sitting beside me before was now standing, my sister. She was holding my hand, whispering something through clenched teeth. I stood behind her and watched. The machines beeped steadily. The rhythm was stronger now. I stared at my own face and wondered how much time had passed. My sister wiped her eyes and turned toward the door. She walked past me without a glance. No shiver, no pause. I wasn't visible. Not yet. I stepped forward and reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the bed. The second my hand touched the blanket, I felt something shift. Not physically, internally. A pull, a collapse, like falling back into place. The world tilted. There was a ringing in my ears, and then darkness. When I woke up, I was in the bed. Not in the dream. Not in the station. Here. Alive. It was 3 days before I could speak again. Another 2 before I could sit up without vomiting. The doctor said I'd suffered a traumatic brain injury in the crash. Swelling, reduced oxygen. A few hours more, they said, and I wouldn't have come back at all. They used words like miracle. I didn't. I didn't tell them about the train, or the station, or the girl. I nodded when they said I was lucky. I thanked the nurses. I smiled at the specialists. But deep down, I knew that what had happened wasn't a dream, and it wasn't over. For the first few weeks after I was discharged, I chalked it all up to brain chemistry. Near-death hallucinations, subconscious fear responses. It made sense on paper. But then I started seeing her again, not in person, in reflections. It started small, a glimpse in the microwave door, late at night. A flicker in the corner of the bathroom mirror when I turned away. Always the same image. A girl in a blue raincoat, sitting, holding that same plastic toy, never moving, just watching. Once I found her reflection in the screen of my phone, blacked out, locked, before it powered on. I stopped using mirrors when I could avoid them. I covered the one in my bedroom with a towel, took the one down in the hallway, avoided looking too long at storefront windows, but it didn't help. The dreams returned next. Not the train, not the platform, just her. She'd appear in the distance, standing in a room or hall or alley, never walking, never speaking, and I'd feel that same cold fear spread through my ribs, across my skin. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, chest tight, the sound of my name whispered against my ear, even when I was alone. After 3 months, I moved. New apartment, new neighborhood. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't want to talk about it, but deep down, I thought maybe distance would help. Maybe I had brought something back with me, a thread still tied to that place, and if I severed it, I could finally be free. But moving didn't help. The reflections followed. A year passed. I kept my job, I kept my head down, but I didn't sleep much. I didn't talk to people unless I had to. My sister tried visiting once, but I pretended I wasn't home. I couldn't let her see what I'd become, a man terrified of mirrors and shadows, of glass and silence. Then 2 nights ago, something changed. I woke up to the sound of a bell. Not a phone, not an alarm, a station bell. That faint, hollow clang I'd heard at the beginning, it was unmistakable. I sat up in bed and looked around. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too deep. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. It didn't work. I reached for my phone. The screen flickered, then went black. The reflection showed her face before it died. I got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The light there flickered once, then went out. Then I heard the hum, low, mechanical, vibrating through the floorboards, like an engine beneath my feet. I turned toward the living room, and there, standing in front of the covered mirror, was the girl. No reflection this time, no illusion. She was in my home. Her raincoat dripped water onto the hardwood. The toy in her hand was stained and warped as if it had been underwater for years. Her eyes were still wide, her face blank. But this time she spoke aloud. "You got off too early," she said. I backed away. She took 1 slow step forward. There's still 1 more stop. The room began to change. The walls cracked, paint curling into flakes, the ceiling sagged. The air filled with the smell of mildew and concrete dust. The floor beneath me trembled. I turned and ran toward the door, flung it open, and stopped cold. Outside was not my hallway. It was a platform. Dim, silent, lined with benches, and a train had just arrived. Its doors opened with a hiss. I looked back over my shoulder. The girl was gone, but I knew she was inside. I stepped forward onto the platform, heart hammering. My apartment was gone. My body, maybe. My life. It didn't matter anymore. The train waited, and I knew, with every part of me, this really was the end of the line.